Welcome back, everybody. Excuse my voice, I'm feeling a little sinusy today. This is going to be kind of a random video, but for those of you who are weird like me and want to work on a Subaru Outback instead of a cool car like a WRX, this is probably the only video on YouTube about this. But basically, I'm going to be lowering this car, and it involves a little bit more than a Honda Civic would involve for lowering, because it has 2-inch subframe spacers on all of the subframes, and it involves a little more than you might think to remove those. So I'm going to go through all the steps and parts you'll need to remove the subframe spacers on a Subaru Outback. This is good for first and second gens at least. I think it might be good for third gens too, but I've honestly never worked on those. But let's go ahead and get into it. Alright, so first things first, the parts you're going to need are as follows. You're going to need the front rear, so like the front lower control arms with the rear bushings from a Legacy, not an Outback. They're slightly different with the placement of these tabs. You're going to need the U-joint off of the steering rack of a Legacy, and you're possibly going to need these. I found these on a first gen Subaru Outback, or Subaru Legacy I should say, and they were just kind of part of the subframe. The second gens don't have these on the Legacies, so you might be able to get away without using them. I don't know how long the threads on the studs are though, so we'll find that out as we go. And that's pretty much all you'll actually need to do this, aside from a lot of patience and effort. Pretty universal first step of working on your suspension is get the car off the ground, get the wheels off the hubs, and show you what we're working with here. You got to go up underneath the subframe right here, and you'll see you got the actual subframe right here. This is more of just a brace of sorts. It's used to connect some things to you, so you have to retain this. But then this black piece up between the frame and the subframe is the spacer for the front. And if you look in the rear, you'll see those lower control arms. On the Legacies, these are all the way at the bottom, but on these they're spaced upwards, so you got to swap those out. And then on the rear, it's a lot more simple. Nothing's actually connected to the frame except for the lower control arm, which you don't actually have to remove any spacing from. But you've got these spacers on the frame right here and back here. You're gonna have to drop the subframe to remove those and then bolt it all back up. You might need new bolts for the subframe on the rear. We're gonna find that out in just a minute when we get to those. Alright, starting in the rear, I'm going to go ahead and pull out these two bolts and this suspension bolt back here. Start with this one first so it doesn't hang anything else up. Before you actually remove all those 4 bolts, actually 6 bolts that are holding the subframe to the frame and the suspension, you're going to want to go ahead and support the rear subframe by the differential, otherwise it's just going to fall on the ground on you. Just like that. Alright, now that you got all those 6 bolts out, we're going to go ahead and lower the subframe just enough so we can pull these out, and then we're just going to put it all back together. That'll do it. Now the issue is that these bolts, which I was thinking are probably going to be too long because of the subframe spacers, are definitely way too long. You can see the threads don't even go into the actual bushings, so I'm gonna make a quick trip to the junkyard, find some actual Legacy bolts, and then I'll be right back. Alright, I'm back from the junkyard, and turns out the bolts are very different. So you're definitely gonna need some Legacy rear subframe bolts. And while I was there, I also realized that whereas these are the top pieces for the Outback, these are the ones for the Legacy. It's probably a good idea to have these two. A little crusty, but they'll work, because these are going to sit between the bushing and the frame, and more than likely not do a whole lot, but probably make the bushing last a little bit longer and not as much noise while moving around on the road. Now, the rear, so where the front has these, they'll just slip onto the top and thread in like this, so this whole piece will retain like around the bushing area. The rears don't have that. They have these pieces, and you'll notice on the Outback this side is pretty far spaced. And so I was thinking I was gonna have to get the bracket off the Legacy for this, but then I realized you can just do this. Just take the top piece off when it was an Outback and just slide it underneath, and then you'll just take your original bolt, slide it through, and then you don't have to replace that. It doesn't interfere with the sway bar or anything. So get this in here, and on the other side, now on the other side, the piece isn't exactly the same. It's a bit longer and it stretches out more than just sort of comes down from the frame. And because of that, if you just loosen the inner bolts on the frame, this will actually bolt up just fine to this. You can use it, but then you're gonna get this piece in the way. I don't know why they added this to the Outback frame or subframe, but it's gonna interfere with the height right here, as you can tell. So I'm gonna take a saw to this and chop it off. But other than that, it doesn't seem like anything else is getting in the way. So I'm gonna do that real quick and get right back to you. Well, good news is I did not have to use a Sawzall. Turns out that this piece is just bolted into the anti-sway bar mount, and it's got a little pin, clip right there. You just pull right off, and then whatever this is here for will be out of your way for good. Alright, so this looks like I was wrong about the this brace right here in the back. It's actually not, it doesn't have enough adjustment from the bolt on the inside to move it out far enough when it's lowered. So what you could do is replace it with the right one, like off the Legacy, or in this case, just like I did on the other side, just grab your older subframe spacer, put it on the bottom, and then just use the longer bolt that the car originally had, and that'll thread right on like that. Again, it doesn't interfere with anything. It shouldn't affect the performance of anything, but it's one way to get it done. If you want to get it done the right way, again, just swap this out with the right one. Otherwise, you know, save yourself the trip to the junkyard and just do this. Alright, now moving on to the front end, you might want to drop your exhaust manifold, because you're going to have to get to the steering linkage up there, and it's a little tough to get to through the top or through the bottom, honestly, either way, with this in the way. But if you can manage it with it on, just leave it on, whatever. But whenever you remove these subframe bolts to drop the subframe, it's not really going to change anything, because the subframe is going to go down with the engine and still bolt it down, right? So you should be able to get these out of the way without removing the exhaust, or without removing the exhaust manifold and dropping a subframe apart from the engine, what I'm trying to say. So we go ahead and pop these off. I'm going to have to pop these off as well, get this out of the way, and then try to remove this out of the way and lower this down, try to get the steering linkage off, as well as the subframe spacers. So let me go ahead and do that and be right back. Alright, so I removed the two 17mm nuts that are on both sides of the subframe to hold it up. You can see I've supported it with the jack, so it's not going to fall down all the way. The rear bushing is still going to hold it onto the frame for the most part, so you don't have to worry too much about it falling all the way down, but still keep a jack there for your own safety. Now that it's a little bit dropped, I'm going to go ahead and get the steering rack, or steering column U-joint off. I think the easiest way to get to this is from underneath the car. You can try it from on top of the car too, but I feel like there's a little bit more stuff in the way like that. Move it under here. You just reach your hand through this hole, and there's a couple 12 millimeter bolts down here, And up here, just bear in mind while you're doing this that if you can see that the starter is right there and that wire that goes to it is hot, so if you touch that while it's touching the frame, it's going to shock you. So if you haven't already, I'd recommend disconnecting your batteries or your battery so you don't get yourself shocked. Or if you're brave, you can keep going for it, but just bear that in mind. Alright, I got the steering linkage not removed, but the bolts are off, so it should be able to pop off as soon as I drop the subframe. But this is kind of hanging me up right now, not being able to move it down far enough, so I'm going to pop this off real quick. And that way I can lower the subframe some more, pull that off, replace it, replace these, and finally pull these spacers off. So this is going to be a 19, and if I remember correctly, this is a 22? It's not a 22, it's a 23. It's not a 21 though, like I thought it was originally. So you're going to want to start with this one, preferably lube it up a little bit with some penetrating fluid, and then you'll, after you get this one loose and off, just take this whole cap off, pull these off, and then this should pull down just enough to slide this off, and then you can just put the new one on. So I'm going to do that real quick and get right back. Cool. Now that I got that off, you can clearly see the difference between the Outback and the Legacy rear, front lower control arm bushing. Also, mine's torn up, so it's a good thing I'm replacing these. Yeah, that's why you gotta swap that out. Alright, so when unbolting the spacer itself, you can see it's mostly loose now. There's obviously a bolt back here, and there's two right here, and then it's still not gonna come out. You gotta look all the way forward. There's one all the way up here. There we go. Now this piece is loose, but I gotta get this off. It's being held on by it, obviously. That out of the way. If you can just pry this down enough, you should be able to just get it out. But I think I'm gonna have to drop the transmission mount too, because the front of the engine doesn't want to go down quite far enough for it. Alright, yeah, so I dropped the transmission mount, and that made everything a lot easier. Whole subframe fell down, subframe spacer out of the way. And it also popped off the steering U-joint. So now I can just pull that out, hopefully. Being held on there with some surprising force. Anyway, I got that off, and this is the Outback one, this is the Legacy one. You can clearly see the difference there. So I'm gonna go ahead and put this one back in place, and then we'll get the other subframe bushing off and put this stuff back up into the car. Alright, now I got both subframe spacers removed. Now this is probably going to be the hardest part in my opinion. So I got to re-lift the subframe up, align it with both the studs on both sides, while simultaneously trying to align the steering column U-joint into the actual steering rack. And then if I can actually manage to align all that stuff, I should just be able to lift it all back up, bolt on the nuts to hold this in place, and then everything else I can do with the jack out from underneath the car and just kind of tie stuff up. Alright, now here's where these pieces come in. You can't really see, it goes all the way up in there, but these studs that are part of the frame, they don't have threads going all the way up because they're lengthened for the Outback because it's got the subframe spacers. So luckily, like I said, I found these on a first gen Legacy, and these fit right over top of here, And all I gotta do is just lift it up a bit more, right, to get it more space, or you know, get it actually attached to, like, all the way up against the frame. And then I should be able to just bolt on to the bottom of this instead, and that'll create the space that the subframe spacers used to make up. Well, I lied to you guys. So this piece that came off of that first gen's Legacy would work, but on these second gens, I don't know if you can see that, but they got these little plates welded in place, and it's just basically, it's messing up the clearance that I'm going to need to get this in place. It won't quite go on far enough, so all I can really get is to there. So I'm just going to have to make some spacers and make use of it instead. So here's what I came up with. I've got a box of these sitting around. I'm not 100% sure what size it is, but whatever it is, it's one size above these. So I'm just going to slot that up there and then use the nut to tighten that down. Just have a little spacer in the way. If you don't want to do that, I did realize that if you go up above into the engine bay, you can tell these are actually loose inside there. They just stick through the frame, and they're on a little bracket piece. So if you wanted to, you could just remove these entirely out through the top of the frame and replace them with the ones off of the Legacy, and you'd be good to go with just the nuts. But I don't really want to make another run to the junkyard. I'm just going to make this work the way it is. This will work just fine, obviously. So I'm going to do that really quick, and then we'll move on to the next step. And that next step would be to install the Legacy rear, front, lower control arm bushings. So just slide these on, just like that. Get your rubber outer bushing piece and your metal retainer, and wherever I put that nut, there it is. Get your bolts. It's a good thing to note, turns out that these are tapered, so you gotta have the right side going in. So this is for the other side of the car. I'm gonna have to go get the right one to put on this side now. Alright, well, another thing I'm learning is that these are also directional. They're not the same on the top and the bottom. I'm pretty sure I got this one mixed up. So I gotta remove it again, flip it around, and reinstall it. You guys know Murphy? I know Murphy. I know Murphy way too well. Sweet. Now you don't want to tighten this just yet. You want to wait until you get the suspension at ride height and then torque it all down. That way it doesn't rip up the bushing while you're driving around. But I'm going to go do the other side, and then we're going to move on to the suspension itself. Don't forget to install these pieces, I guess. if you feel like it. They honestly just hold this plastic piece on a little bit extra, and you're gonna have exactly 2 of the correct bolts to put it on with, because there's gonna be this one and then the one at the front, the right side. The other ones are too long for this, and you're gonna notice that the one up here does not line up anymore. As with the running trend with the rest of the stuff on this, you could probably swap it out for one off of a Legacy and it works just fine. Honestly, you could probably just leave it off too. I'm just gonna go ahead and install it for now. If it rattles around or anything like that while I'm driving, I'm gonna take it off probably, because it honestly doesn't do all that much. That's about it. One thing I forgot to mention about lowering your subframe, you're going to want to remove this, I think it's called a torque mount. It goes right here, this piece. I forgot to include it because mine doesn't actually have that installed, because it turns out on the 6-cylinder ones, when you install the manual transmission to it to do a manual swap, there's no spacers on the transmission brace, or subframe, whatever you want to call it, but there is on the main subframe, so the engine sits too low, which causes this to not line up whenever it's still got subframe spacers in place. So now that I've removed those, this will actually fit, I'm pretty sure. Kind of hard to measure up right now, and I still got the bolt in place because I was planning on doing this eventually, but yeah, as you can see, it's pretty close, and I'm fairly certain it'll work finally, which will be good because these engines rock around a lot when they don't have this in place. But yeah, just a thing to note, if you ever want to manual swap your 6-cylinder Outback, you have to delete this unless you delete your subframe spacers. Another thing to note is that this driver's side upper radiator hose is going to kink itself whenever the engine is raised. So you're going to need to modify this a little bit. Not entirely sure how, honestly, because you're having to cut it in the middle. Or I guess maybe I can shorten this, make it extend out more. I don't know, I'll figure it out. I'll show you what I do later. And as for that upper radiator hose issue, I did pretty much exactly what I said I was going to do. Trimmed off about that much from the end, just sort of extended it that way a bit, and it worked out perfectly. Alright, now that the subframe spacers are all out, you've got your new lower control arm bushings in, and you know, the whole like subframe portion of it is done. Next part's pretty easy. You just take out these 2 bolts, take out the 3 bolts up top. Kind of the same thing for the rear, except it's just like the lower bolt right here that we already took out, and then like 2 of them at the top inside the car. But basically you just remove your suspension, install your new suspension, whichever you're going to use to lower it, and then torque check everything, put it back in the ground, get it aligned, good to go. The rear strut tower bolts are a lot easier to get to than I expected to, actually. All you gotta do is just remove this panel right here, and you can remove this panel right here, you don't really have to. Push the seat forward. Push the seat forward to get to the front ones. And you're done. Alright, now that you got your new suspension installed, all you gotta do is just adjust the ride height and the preload of the springs as much as you feel like tinkering with that. But you're also going to have an issue with the fact that now the suspension is lower, you're going to be hitting your bump stops. And the ride height that I've already tested this at will sit right on the bump stop where I want it to be. So I'm going to take off about an inch or 2 of this. That way there will still be some rubber left for it to hit. If I do, hit a big bump and bottom out, I don't want to just smack metal on metal. I mean, if you want to, you can just remove this entirely. I figure they probably make some aftermarket ones too if you want to look into that. Me personally, I have a Sawzall, and that's a lot quicker and cheaper than most other options, so we're just going to do this. There we go. Yeah. A little flatter and wider than it used to be, but it'll still do its job of being a bump stop. Alright, FYI, if you're running these max peating rod coilovers like I am, they're honestly not a terrible coilover, especially not for the cost, obviously. But these upper pillow ball bushings and these upper bearings on the top of the front struts, they tend to make a lot of noise whenever you're on the road, especially after a little bit of wear happens. So before you actually install them, it's a good idea to just dab a little bit of this bearing grease in them, just to lube them up a little bit. It gets rid of a lot of the noise, takes care of like a pretty large portion of what the issue with them is. So just kind of pack it into this groove as good as you can. I'm gonna make a mess here, but it doesn't matter. Just like that. I do top and bottom as much as you can. Same to the other side, and then obviously right here, just kind of lube it up around here a bit, and that'll get rid of the noise. Okay. I'm gonna go ahead and finish this up and then get them back in the car. Alright, so I kind of glazed over this part because honestly it was not working out the way I was hoping it would. But it turns out that with the steering U-joint, you can't actually just use the U-joint itself from the Legacy, because instead of just designing two separate U-joints for Legacies and Outbacks, Subaru decided that for some reason they needed to have a completely different steering column. And because of that, instead of being able to swap out just the U-joints, you actually have to swap out the U-joint and the whole steering rack. Luckily, I kept that whole assembly from the parts car I had, so I mean I got the right part, but it's kind of a pain to swap both of them out, and I'll show you why here in just a second. So as you can see, the mounting points for inside the car are lined up, and you can see there's about an inch, maybe an inch and a half of difference between the Legacy and the Outback steering column. And so it wouldn't be a huge deal, right? Because I could just, you know, swap everything from one onto the other, you know, put it in the car and call it a day. But unlike on some older model Hondas that I'm used to, the key lock cylinder on these is bolted in. It's got the same type of bolts. They have the head that's kind of, you know, it has like a little breaking point in the middle, so they tighten it down, it breaks off, and nobody can steal your key lock cylinder very easily, right? It's for anti-theft. Unfortunately, whereas on Hondas these are exposed still, so you can just sort of get a screwdriver or a chisel and a hammer and work them out. In this case they're countersunk, so you gotta actually drill them out with a like a screw extractor. So still doable, but kind of sucks because I'm not so sure if a just like a regular 12mm bolt will bolt right into those holes or not. It might get jammed up, so I'm probably gonna have to go to Subaru, get some new bolts. That way I can actually, you know, put it in the right way. That way I don't have to use, you know, the key from the Legacy, because honestly I don't like having two keys for one car, and I like to avoid that by doing it the right way. So I'm gonna go ahead and get this in. Just, you know, bear this in mind. If you do this yourself, you're gonna have to do this. If you just get the steering column from a junkyard car and keep the key, you won't have to do that. But, you know, if you don't want to have two keys for the same car, then you're gonna have to drill that out, put the new bolts in, and of course I'll let you know if I can fit regular bolts in there or not, but so far I'm thinking I'm gonna have to buy some OEM ones. So let me do that and I'll get back to you. Alright, here they are drilled out, and you just get a full focus screw extractor, stick it in the hole, and it'll bite down and grab onto that. These things aren't really tightened down very far. They're like maybe 10 foot-pounds, so they come out super easy. You just gotta, you know, you can't get them out with like a regular bolt. You gotta get a screw extractor involved. But again, luckily they come out pretty easily. Alright, here's what I was worried about. So I got the right size bolts for the holes, but unfortunately the actual like retainer sort of clip piece, it does not go in there. So I called up Subaru dealership, got a part number, so I'm gonna go pick up a couple of those right now, and then we'll reinstall this. I just got back from the dealership. Here's the part number you're gonna need, and they were $259, super cheap. Now to install these, you're gonna do something that's gonna feel inherently wrong, but basically just get it all centered up so it actually fits on right. Make sure this is flush. These tighten down by hand, And then you're just going to tighten them until you break off the head. You know, the thing that if you were to do to any other bolt would make you cringe. Just like that. Do it to both and then you're done. Alright, so a question that's probably on a lot of your minds is, do I even have to do this? Sure, you could just put some suspension on the car, so yeah, technically no, you don't have to do this. However, the way the suspension is raised off the body of the car, or the subframe I should say, it's going to affect your roll center is the issue. So whereas with it being at the stock, the ride height at stock, the lower control arms are sitting like this at ride height, and you hit a turn and you compress the suspension a bit, you're gonna send your lower control arm up at an angle a bit, right? But it's still gonna be more or less parallel with the ground, and that way that force pushing on the tire and your suspension is going like this. Well, if you remove those subframe spacers, and well, if you don't remove your subframe spacers and then you lower your car anyway, now you're riding like this, while just not being under any load at all, just sitting on the ground. Then you go around a turn, you load the suspension, it loads even more, and you still have this force pushing this way, and now you've got leverage on it, and it's wanting to push that control arm up even more because of that, and that's going to cause your car to roll around a lot more than it should, even if it has upgraded suspension and everything. So with this, instead of riding like this, when it's lowered, you're going to remove those spacers to get your roll center more at parallel, and it's just going to make the car handle a lot better. If you want to actually do a little enthusiastic driving with the car, it's just going to pay dividends to do this instead of just taking the easy route and just putting coilovers on it. And I'll give you an example here. So this is actually my car with the suspension preloaded with a jack at what ride height would be. I don't know if you can tell, but it is off the jack stand right now, somewhat. And you can see the lower control arm is sitting almost parallel with the ground. So once I hit a hard turn and load the suspension a little bit more, it's just going to go even closer to parallel. And if I want to actually drive this car on a track, probably won't. Honestly, I'm just doing this mostly for cosmetics. But if I did, that's going to help a lot with my roll center and overall handling. And yeah, that's pretty much the whole reason why you'd want to remove those.